Love isn't measured by the years spent together, but by the sacrifices made in moments of need.
Every morning, before the sun even rises, a tiny, scruffy puppy sits outside the shelter's gate. He doesn't beg for food. He doesn't try to get inside. He just waits. Rain or shine, he's there, silent, watching, waiting. At first, the volunteers think he's just another stray looking for food. But when one of them finally decides to follow him, what she discovers leaves her in tears. And by the end of this story, you'll understand why. Stray dogs are everywhere. They wander the streets, searching for food, warmth, and sometimes just a little kindness. But this puppy, he was different. He had a mission. For weeks, he appeared like clockwork outside the shelter's entrance, his little body shivering in the cold. But no matter how many times they tried to call him in, he wouldn't budge. And when a volunteer named Sarah finally decided to follow him, she found something that broke her heart in ways she never expected. This is the story of a puppy's loyalty, a heartbreaking secret, and the incredible power of love. Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that something was different about this stray puppy. The first time she saw him, he was just a small, fragile creature curled up near the shelter gate, barely noticeable in the dim morning light. His fur was a tangled mess of dirt and knots, clinging to his thin frame, his ribs pressed against his skin, a silent testimony to his struggle for survival. But it wasn't just his condition that caught Sarah's attention. It was his eyes. There was something haunting about them, a quiet plea, a silent sorrow, as if he had been waiting for something, someone for a very long time. She reached into her bag, pulling out a piece of bread. Slowly, she knelt down, extending her hand, her voice soft and gentle. "Hey there, little guy. Are you hungry?" For a brief moment, the puppy just stared at her. His tiny body trembled, his nose twitching as he caught the scent of food. But just as Sarah thought he might step forward, he did the opposite. He bolted, not far, just enough to put distance between them. Enough to show he didn't trust her. Enough to show that whatever life had taught him, it wasn't kindness. Sarah sighed, placing the bread on the ground before stepping back. She hoped he'd return once she was gone. Maybe, just maybe, tomorrow would be different. The next morning, as Sarah arrived at the shelter, her heart skipped a beat. He was back, same spot, same quiet stare. It wasn't a coincidence. This puppy wasn't just passing through. He was waiting for something. But what? Or who? Sarah moved slower this time, careful not to startle him. But the moment her footstep crunched against the gravel, he tensed. She stopped, their eyes locked. It was as if he was trying to decide, was she a threat, or was she different? Then, as if reaching his decision, he turned and disappeared into the distance once again. Sarah let out a slow breath. She wasn't giving up. Days passed, then weeks, and every single morning, without fail, he was there, sitting, watching, waiting. The other volunteers began to notice him too. Some of them would leave out food, but he wouldn't touch it while anyone was watching. Others tried calling out to him, coaxing him inside the gate, but the puppy never stepped closer. "He's got hope," one of the volunteers said one day, shaking her head in wonder. "That's all he's got." The name stuck. Hope. And in many ways, it was perfect, because no matter how many nights he spent alone, no matter how many meals he skipped, no matter how cold the pavement got beneath him, he kept waiting. He never gave up. But waiting for what? Or for whom? Sarah began studying him. Not just his behavior, but the way he moved, the way he positioned himself. He never lay completely down, just enough to rest his tired legs. His ears twitched at every sound, his eyes constantly scanning the shelter's entrance, as if expecting someone to walk out and recognize him. It wasn't just about food. This wasn't just about survival. This puppy was looking for something deeper, connection. Sarah's heart ached at the thought. Had he been abandoned? Did he belong to someone who left and never returned? Or was he waiting for a friend, a family? Whatever the reason, it was clear. He didn't want just shelter. He wanted an answer. And Sarah was determined to find it. One evening, Sarah decided to try something different. Instead of reaching out to him, she sat down near the gate. She didn't call out. She didn't try to lure him in. She just sat, watching the world as he did. Minutes passed, then an hour. Hope didn't move from his spot, but Sarah could tell he was watching her too. For the first time, she wasn't just another human trying to coax him in. She was sitting with him. Even with the distance between them, Sarah hoped it made a difference. And in a way, it did. As she got up to leave, Hope didn't run this time. He stayed. His eyes lingered on her a little longer than usual. It was small, but it was something. The next morning, Sarah found him again, in the same place. But something was different. This time, as she walked toward him, he didn't immediately run. He stood up, ears perked, tail stiff. He was nervous, but he didn't flee. Sarah felt her chest tighten. Progress. Slowly, she lowered herself to the ground, careful not to make any sudden movements. "It's okay, buddy," she whispered. "I'm not going to hurt you." Hope took a step back, then another, but this time, he hesitated. His paws shuffled against the dirt as if he were fighting an internal battle. Trust or fear? Sarah reached into her pocket, pulling out a piece of chicken she had brought that morning. She set it down between them, and then leaned back. Minutes passed. Then, finally, with the softest movement, Hope took a step forward. His nose twitched. Another step, and then, for the first time, he reached out and took the food. Sarah exhaled, a breath she didn't even realize she had been holding. It wasn't much, but it was enough. Enough to prove that, despite everything, Hope wanted to trust. He just needed time. That night, Sarah made herself a promise. Whatever Hope was waiting for, whoever he was waiting for, she was going to help him find it. She wasn't going to let him sit outside that gate forever, staring at a world that kept passing him by. Hope had waited long enough. It was time for someone to wait for him, and she was ready. The volunteers tried everything. They left food outside. He wouldn't touch it. They opened the gate, hoping he'd walk in. He'd only back away. No barking, no whining, just waiting. Sarah couldn't stop thinking about him. What was he waiting for? Who was he looking for? One night, after finishing her shift, she made a decision. She was going to follow him. The shelter was silent, the last traces of daylight slipping below the horizon. Most of the volunteers had left, their shift over, their goodbyes already fading into the cool night air. But Sarah wasn't leaving. Not yet. She stood behind the gate, her fingers gripping the metal bars as she watched the tiny figure in the distance. Hope sat in his usual spot, staring into the darkness beyond the shelter's entrance, his little body still except for the occasional shiver. Sarah held her breath. What was he waiting for? Every night, he stayed. Every night, he refused warmth, food, or comfort. And yet, he never truly left. But tonight was different. Tonight, she was going to find out why. Minutes passed before Hope finally stirred. His ears twitched. His nose lifted slightly, as if catching a scent only he could recognize. Then, without hesitation, he rose to his feet and started walking. Sarah's heart pounded. This was it. This was the moment she had been waiting for. Carefully, she pushed open the gate, slipping into the shadows behind him. Her footsteps were light, barely making a sound against the concrete, as she followed at a safe distance. Hope moved with quiet determination, his tiny paws tapping softly on the pavement. He didn't wander, didn't hesitate. He was going somewhere. Somewhere important. But where? The streets were nearly empty. A few distant headlights passed, but no one paid attention to the small, fragile creature making his way through the world as if he had a purpose greater than himself. Sarah stayed back, using the buildings and parked cars as cover. Hope never looked back. He never checked his surroundings. It was as if he had walked this path 100 times before. And maybe he had. The deeper they went into the city, the colder the air felt. The glow of streetlights flickered against cracked sidewalks, casting long, lonely shadows. Trash cans were tipped over. Storefronts were locked up for the night. Metal shutters pulled down tight, like closed eyes, refusing to witness the broken world beyond them. Sarah's chest tightened as she watched the puppy weave through the streets, his fragile frame barely noticeable in the dim light. He didn't belong here. He was too small, too young to navigate a world this cruel. Yet he had survived. Somehow, despite the odds, despite the loneliness, despite the hunger, he had survived. But he wasn't just surviving. He was searching, and that made Sarah's stomach twist in ways she couldn't explain. Then suddenly he stopped. Sarah froze, pressing herself against the cold wall of an alleyway. Her breath came out in soft, uneven puffs. Hope stood in the middle of the street, staring straight ahead. That's when Sarah saw it. An old, abandoned house. It stood on the corner, its windows boarded up, its roof sagging with age. The front yard was overgrown with weeds, a rusted gate hanging off one hinge. The place had been forgotten, left to crumble under time's unforgiving hand. And yet, to Hope, it meant something. Sarah's heart clenched as the tiny puppy took a hesitant step forward, his body tense with expectation. His tail gave the smallest of wags, a movement so faint, so hopeful, that Sarah had to blink back the sting in her eyes. She watched as Hope approached the house, slipping through a broken gap in the fence, as if he had done it 100 times before. He didn't hesitate. He didn't sniff around or check his surroundings. He knew this place. This was home, or at least, it had been. Sarah moved closer, her hands gripping the cold metal of the fence as she peered inside. Hope was standing in the middle of the front yard now, his nose pressed against the base of the door, his tiny paws scratched lightly at the wood, a soft whimper escaping his throat. It was the first sound he had made in all the weeks she had known him. Sarah's breath hitched. "Is this what you've been waiting for?" she whispered to herself. Hope let out another small whimper, then sat down, his ears drooping. The silence around him was deafening. Nobody answered. Nobody came. Sarah swallowed the lump forming in her throat. She had been so sure that Hope was waiting for someone, that maybe, just maybe, the person he loved would be here. But the house was empty. It was just an old, abandoned shell. There was no one left. And yet, Hope still waited, still believed, still held on to something that no longer existed. Sarah clenched her fists. This wasn't fair. She took a step closer, careful not to startle him. Hope didn't move. He just sat there, staring at the door with a quiet sadness that made Sarah's chest ache. Had he been left here? Had his family lived in this house once, only to disappear without him? Had he been abandoned, forced to fend for himself while still believing, hoping that they'd come back? Tears burned at the corners of Sarah's eyes. All this time, she thought he was just a lost puppy looking for a home. But no, he had won, or at least, he thought he did. And that was even more heartbreaking. Sarah knew she couldn't leave him here. Not like this. She wiped her face, drawing in a shaky breath before stepping forward, her voice soft and careful. "Hey, buddy," she whispered. Hope's ears flicked at the sound of her voice, but he didn't turn around. She took another step, then another. Hope finally looked back at her, his big, sad eyes filled with something Sarah couldn't quite name. Not fear, not aggression, just uncertainty. She slowly crouched down, keeping her movements gentle. "I know you're waiting," she said, "but maybe it's time to stop." Hope stared at her, unmoving. Sarah swallowed hard, holding out her hand. He didn't run. He didn't move closer either. He just watched her, as if weighing something deep in his little heart. Minutes passed. Then, finally, Hope did something Sarah never expected. He took a step toward her. It was small, hesitant, but it was a step. Sarah smiled, even as tears slipped down her face. Hope wasn't ready yet, but maybe, just maybe, he was starting to believe that he could be. The house was falling apart, broken windows, peeling paint, doors barely hanging onto their hinges. And then Sarah saw it. Hope wasn't alone. In the corner of the porch, curled up in a small nest of torn blankets, was another dog, an older one, thin, weak, barely moving. Sarah's heart sank. Hope had never been waiting for himself. He had been waiting for someone to help his mother. Tears welled in Sarah's eyes. Hope had been spending every single day outside the shelter, hoping, praying, that someone would notice him and follow him back to the only family he had left. Sarah knelt down, speaking softly. "It's okay, baby. I see her now. We'll help her." But Hope didn't trust easily. He backed away, standing protectively over his mother, his little body shaking. Sarah knew she had to act fast. The older dog was in bad shape. She was barely breathing. Gently, she placed a bowl of food in front of them and backed away. She sat there for hours, waiting, letting them know she wasn't a threat. Hope was wary, but hunger won. Slowly, he inched forward, taking a bite. His mother, too weak to move much, licked at the food helplessly. That's when Sarah saw the collar buried beneath her fur. She wasn't always a stray. She had once belonged to someone. Sarah cradled the frail dog in her arms, feeling the sharp bones beneath her thin coat. Lily didn't struggle, didn't whimper. She simply rested her weary head against Sarah's chest, as if she had finally found a moment of peace after a lifetime of suffering. Hope trotted closely beside them, his little body trembling as he glanced up at his mother with worried eyes. The shelter's door swung open as Sarah rushed inside, calling for help. Other volunteers gathered, their expressions shifting from curiosity to heartbreak the moment they saw Lily. She was starving, dehydrated, and exhausted beyond words. Hope pressed himself against her, as if afraid she would disappear the moment he looked away. They wasted no time. Lily was placed on a soft bed, while a veterinarian carefully examined her fragile body. Sarah stood by, stroking Hope's fur as he watched anxiously. The vet sighed, her eyes filled with sorrow. She's severely malnourished. If she had spent another few days out there, she might not have made it. Sarah's heart clenched. She knew that stray dogs had it hard, but to see one in such a heartbreaking condition, one that had clung to life just to be with her puppy, was unbearable. Then came the moment of truth. They needed to check if Lily had a microchip, any clue about her past, any trace of the life she had before the streets. The vet grabbed the scanner, pressed it gently against Lily's frail body, and then, beep, Sarah's breath hitched. Everyone in the room froze as the vet glanced at the screen. "She has won," the vet whispered. A mixture of hope and dread filled Sarah's chest. On one hand, it meant Lily had once been someone's pet. On the other, it meant someone had abandoned her. The vet quickly pulled up the information. Seconds passed in silence before the screen revealed a name. Lily. Sarah's fingers tightened around Hope's fur. That was her name. Not Stray. Not just another lost dog. She had a name, a past, a story, and the story that followed shattered Sarah's heart into pieces. Lily had once been part of a family, a home, a place where she was loved, or at least, she had thought she was, but her owners had moved away. They had packed their things, loaded their furniture, and left. Without her, no food, no water, no goodbye, just left. Sarah felt her throat tighten. How could anyone do that? How could they leave behind a dog who had given them unconditional love? Lily had survived, but barely. She had wandered the streets, searching for food, shelter, some form of kindness. And just when she thought she had nothing left, she gave birth to a litter of puppies. Tiny, helpless creatures who depended on her for everything. But life on the streets was cruel. One by one, her puppies disappeared. Some were taken by strangers. Others she never saw again. The world had stolen her children, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. All except one. Hope, the only one who had stayed. The only one who had refused to leave her side, just as she had once refused to leave the family who abandoned her. Sarah wiped at her eyes, but the tears kept coming. She looked down at Hope, who was now curled up beside his mother, pressing his tiny body against her, as if to remind her that she wasn't alone. And then it all made sense. Hope hadn't been waiting for himself. He hadn't been waiting for food or shelter. He had been waiting for help, for someone, anyone, to save his mother. Every day, he had sat outside that shelter, staring through the bars, hoping that someone would notice, that someone would understand, that someone would care enough to follow him. And Sarah had. Her chest ached with emotions too heavy to name. She knelt beside Lily, brushing a hand over her worn-out body. "You're safe now," she whispered. "You don't have to fight anymore." Lily let out a slow, deep sigh and closed her eyes. Hope watched, his little tail giving the smallest, uncertain wag. For the first time, he wasn't waiting. For the first time, his mother was exactly where she needed to be. Safe, loved, home. Sarah knew that Lily's journey wasn't over. She needed time to heal, to regain her strength. But she promised herself one thing. Lily and Hope would never be abandoned again. Days turned into weeks, and with each passing moment, Lily grew stronger. Hope never left her side, always watching over her, always making sure she was okay. And Sarah, she had made her decision. She wasn't going to let them go, because some souls are meant to be together. Some stories are meant to be rewritten, and some bonds, no matter how broken, are meant to be healed. Lily needed medical care. She was weak, dehydrated, and sick, but she was still holding on, and Hope never left her side. The volunteers worked tirelessly to bring them back to health. It took weeks, medicine, warm blankets, constant care, but slowly, Lily's strength returned, and with it, something even more beautiful. Hope, once a scared, skittish puppy, started trusting. For the first time, he wagged his tail. For the first time, he played. And then came the best news of all. A woman had been visiting the shelter, watching their progress, falling in love with their bond. One day, she came forward. "I want to adopt them, both of them." Sarah had never smiled so wide. The day Lily and Hope left the shelter, there wasn't a dry eye in sight. Sarah kneeled down, stroking Hope's for one last time. "You did it, buddy. You saved her." Hope licked her hand, a silent thank you. As they drove off to their new home, Sarah looked up at the sky and whispered, "Not all heroes wear capes. Some just wait outside a shelter, hoping someone will listen." If this story touched your heart, don't forget to subscribe for more inspiring animal rescue stories.